Hi guys, today we're out here at the Soda City Market, just out here talking to people about the Ten Commandments today. First of all, what is your general thoughts?
They're good for people to live by. Yeah.
Do you live by the Ten Commandments?
Probably not to the best, but I mean, some of them, yeah.
What is your overall impression of the Ten Commandments? What do you think
I think there's supposed to be a guideline.
Mm-hmm. Are there any that you don't like?
I don't think I'll be able to say that.
Okay.
10 Commandments are it. Live your life by it the best you can.
I mean, I think as a basic code, there's nothing necessarily wrong with them. You certainly would hope people don't cheat on their spouses. You don't want anybody to kill anybody. Just as basic tenets of human behavior.
So we're just out here talking to people about the Ten Commandments. How do you feel about them?
I think they're great. And I'm a Christian, so I believe in the Bible. So I believe it was God's will and God's divine knowledge that gave us the Ten Commandments, and it's something that we should implement in society.
First of all, do you think the commandments came from God?
Yes.
Why do you think he gave them to us?
To help, to have clear ways to help us change our behavior and to know not as just what is right and what is wrong, but how to help live our lives a little more.
Would you say the Ten Commandments are for our good?
I do. They are for our good.
And that's the name of the series. I don't know if you caught that. Pretty cool how that works, right? Hey, good to meet y'all. My name is Jake, if I haven't met you yet. And today we're going to be looking at the Second Commandment. So if you have a Bible, turn with me to Deuteronomy Chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. Deuteronomy Chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. And I'll just go ahead and say we have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of Bible to work through. So I did have an intro for us, but for the sake of time, I'm cutting it. But you could imagine, it was going to be the most compelling introduction. You were going to laugh, your emotions were going to get tugged, you would be hooked in. But for the sake of time, we don't have time to do that intro. So just imagine that I did, okay? Tracking? Deuteronomy chapter 5. Let's go ahead and read that. It says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." So to recap, commandment number 1 last week was, "You shall have no other gods before me. You worship me alone. Don't worship the wrong gods. You worship the right God. I am Yahweh." And the second commandment is pretty similar. So commandment number 1 is about worshiping the right God as opposed to the wrong God. And commandment number 2 is about worshiping the right God, but worshiping him in the wrong way. And so back then, the common practice of the ancient Near East, other religions around them, they would worship a god or multiple gods, and they would create little icons or images out of stone or wood or whatever. And they didn't actually believe that these icons were divine in and of themselves, but rather the altars and the icons sort of served as this divine gateway into the spiritual realm. And so that if you do enough practices, enough rituals, you would be able to, through this gateway, to get a favor and blessing from whatever God that you worship. And what is wild about it is when it comes to all of the 10 commandments, so just think about them for a sec. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. Of all of the 10 commandments, this is actually the first one that they break, which is wild. And the backstory of that is in Exodus chapter 32. It's going to be on the screen for us, but to give you some setup here, like we mentioned in the weeks before, that God has supernaturally rescued Israel out of captivity, out of Egypt, just supernaturally throwing some plagues on Pharaoh and of Egypt to show, hey, I am God alone. I alone am to be worshiped. And then after that, he's leading the people out into the desert. You imagine, the Red Sea parting, just supernatural work, how the Red Sea closes on Pharaoh, wipes out his enemies. And then they're wandering through the desert, and right before Exodus 32 happens, God calls up Moses to climb up to Mount Sinai to meet with him. And the whole episode seems like something out of a natural disaster movie. There's like, whenever God speaks, there's an earthquake, there's thunder, there's lightning. And so Moses is called by God to climb up the mountain to meet with God. And at the top of the mountain is this dark smoke. You can't even see the mountaintop. And there's all this fire and lightning going on the mountaintop. And the people are freaked out and they're scared. And Moses is the only one who gets to climb up the mountaintop to meet with God. So all this to say, very obvious, it is Yahweh God who is working with his people, supernaturally rescuing them and redeeming them. And then you get to Exodus 32. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron being Moses' brother, and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him. So you can almost imagine how the Israelites are sort of bullying Aaron right now. Like, hey, we know that Yahweh has been speaking to Moses, but we haven't seen him for a minute. We know he went up to the mountain. We don't know when he's coming back. Hey, Aaron, get your brother in line. Get him to come down here quickly. And if he doesn't, then we need to do something. You got to take matters into your own hands. And then we get to verse 2. So Aaron said to them, all right, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. So just so we know, you see that last phrase, a feast to the Lord, a feast to Yahweh. So Aaron essentially is saying this golden calf, this golden bull that you made is Yahweh. And we're going to worship him because this thing is what brought us up out of the land of Egypt. So I just want us to note here, okay, this is a weird story. What's the big deal? What's going on? And I think the biggest clue is really understanding like what the deal is with the golden calf of all things. Why did they build a calf for themselves? So a couple reasons. Number one, the surrounding nations had gods, had images that looked exactly like this. The surrounding nations were doing what the Israelites did. And God's people were supposed to be holy and set apart. And by Israel creating this golden calf, they were essentially saying, hey, we just want to be like the other nations. We know you've called us out, you've set us apart, but honestly, we just want to look like these guys and we want to do what these guys are doing. But at another level, the golden calf or the bull, it was a symbol of power and control at that time. So think about it. The Israelites, they don't have a country or a kingdom or a land to call their own, and they've been wandering through the desert. And you got to imagine that they are probably feeling pretty weak and powerless and insecure. And so they want to make this golden calf, this image of God, and they're feeling so insecure. So what do? They create an image of God to make them feel powerful and secure because the calf was the symbol of that. And in doing so, they created this false projection of God in order to give them this sense of security and power. And they were feeling insecure in that moment. They feel like God has bailed on them completely or that God wasn't working according to their timeline. So they had to take matters into their own hands. And this gets into the heart of the Second Commandment, that they were projecting all of their wants, all their hopes, all their desires onto Yahweh God. So they created a false image of him, and they projected this false image onto who God is. Essentially, they were saying they want a God who thinks like they do, who wants what they want, a God who does what they want, a God who will make them like the rest of the world around them in order to fulfill all of their hopes and dreams and desires. Pastor and author Tim Keller in the book Counterfeit Gods puts it like this, that the heart of breaking the Second Commandment is like creating a Stepford God, which was alluding to a movie back then called The Stepford Wives. If you've never seen it, it's a really messed up movie, But the plot is, and if you are planning to watch The Stepford Wives tonight, this is a big spoiler alert, so, just cover your ears if this was in your queue for tonight. It's a very old movie. I don't know why you suddenly decided to watch it tonight, but spoiler alert, Stepford Wives is essentially about this family that goes to this small town, and they realize that all the wives are just all acting the same. They're very subservient to their husbands, and they are just doing everything that their husbands want and desire. They're essentially like devoid of any personality whatsoever. They just are almost like butlers to their husbands, and they don't ever have any shred of personality whatsoever, and it's all creepy and weird. And then twist, we find out, again, spoiler alerts, here we go. The twist we find out is that all of these wives are actually robots, and that the husbands exchanged their real wives. They had them kidnapped in exchange for a robot version of their wives to just cater and suit their needs. All right, spoiler alert, okay? But the movie's kind of messed up, but that's kind of the point, because that story was written during the 60s, during a time when I think in a lot of ways was correcting some gender stereotypes going on about how women were mistreated and dehumanized in the process. And so this story was a way to sort of poke fun at how messed up that culture was. And Keller and the Second Commandment would argue that this is actually what is going on when we make God into our own image. We're creating a Stepford God. We debase him. And we exchange him. We swap out the truth of who he is and who he's all about, and we exchange him for a fake version of God who ultimately exists to cater and to serve my needs, devoid of any personality. And we create him as a sort of cosmic butler in a sort of way to ultimately say yes to the things we want him to say yes about. But it's not really him. It's not the real thing. It's a counterfeit. And the image of the God that we create is not going to look like creating a golden calf, probably. And it's not going to look like creating a robot God or whatever. But we turn God into a false image when we believe he simply caters to serve my needs and my wants and my agenda. Or we will elevate certain attributes of God that we like, and we will downplay the attributes of God that we don't like. And therein lies the heart of breaking the Second Commandment. So think about it like this. Have you ever noticed people who say they're Christian or love Jesus, who say they follow God? Have you ever noticed whenever those people talk about God that it kind of sounds like God is just a bigger version of their own personality type? I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Like people who are perhaps very rigid and uptight and very rules-based, often when they talk about God, they talk about them in the same way. That God is apparently also very uptight and very judgy and very condescending and very rules-based, just like them, but not very gracious, not very compassionate. No, all that stuff is downplayed. Or on the flip side, people who are very free-spirited and loving and tolerant and kind, that whenever they talk about God, they project all those same personality types onto God, that God is essentially, the most loving, most tolerant, most kind person you would ever imagine. They're very carefree and supportive, and God is essentially just this go-with-the-flow personality, someone who helps you achieve all your dreams and doesn't really sweat the specifics of what you do or say, so long as you're ultimately nice to people at the end of the day. But you know what's going on there, right? In both of those instances, we're projecting a false image onto God, but not just any image, but an image of ourselves. We're projecting our personality types onto God. And just want to tell you that God is not simply just a bigger version of your Myers-Briggs or your Enneagram number, right? And he's not mine either. But when we do that, we are breaking the heart of the Second Commandment, and we are all susceptible to this. And maybe it doesn't look like creating a literal piece of rock or a gold statue or creating an altar, but we often project ourselves onto God and create a false image of him. So for example, if we like to see ourselves as good people, we will craft a God who affirms that in us, a God who hates what we hate, and maybe he will even hate the people that we hate, who gets really angry at the sin struggles of others while overlooking our own, or perhaps a God who doesn't care about sin at all, because if he doesn't care, then I don't have to care. But when you do that, that's a counterfeit. That's creating a false image of God. Or how about this? We want the approval of the world around us, so we will shift God into a more gentle creature, one who doesn't tell you that what you're doing is wrong or that anything in you needs to change. And he ultimately exists to affirm you and make you feel good about yourself and what you're doing and where you're going in life. So we will tone down his righteousness and his justice and his holiness, and we will crank up and emphasize his love, so long as we don't ruffle any feathers, ultimately. But when we do that, it is a counterfeit. We're creating a Stepford God. We're not worshiping the real thing. Or let's say we want success and superiority of our nation. We are all about our nation is the best, greatest thing ever. So we fashion a God into the likes of how he views America as being the best country ever on the face of the planet, who holds our nation near and dear to his heart while being somewhat skeptical of other countries and passionately agrees with the tenets of capitalism. Again, that is a counterfeit God, a Stepford God. That is not the real thing. Or we want approval from our church, so we fashion God into something like a school teacher who gives us a grade each day on how well we do so that we feel really puffed up and better than other people, and we have little grace or compassion for those outside of our own little bubble and little tolerance for people who don't live up to our own expectations. Or we create God into our image when we make him all about justice and no grace whatsoever. So we're big on saying what's right and what's wrong, but we have absolutely no category at all for forgiveness. So we shut people out of our lives, or we stew over a conversation, or we build a case against someone, and we cancel people from culture, offering no hope for redemption and restoration whatsoever. When we do these things, we are creating a Stepford God. We are breaking the Second Commandment. We're creating a counterfeit version of ourselves. And these idols are built by our imaginations, but more often than not, we don't even realize that we're doing it. Which, to be clear, I do this too. So I'm not saying this so as to point the finger solely at y'all. Like, I do this all the time too, and I can easily treat God like some transactional relationship, that if I just teach enough Bible things and if I do enough churchy things, then my life would go easy, free from any stress or worry, and just full of comfort, and just all of my hopes and dreams are realized. But when I do that, I'm breaking the Second Commandment. And when you think about the breaking of the Second Commandment in terms of this, then it starts to become clear that making a false image of God is not this foreign, outdated concept, but it is something that all of us do. And here's why this is a big deal to God. So keep reading with me, verse 9 of Deuteronomy chapter 5. God says, "You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, am a jealous God." Think about that. He says, don't do that. Why? Because I am a jealous God. So to clarify, why is this one commandment in God's top 10? Answer, because he is jealous, which I think for many of us, myself included, are kind of thinking, that's bad, right? Like, jealousy is a bad thing. God, what are you doing being jealous? So to clarify, when we think of jealousy, we tend to think of not being satisfied with what we have, this posture of discontentment, wanting something for the wrong reasons or for selfish reasons, whether that be jealousy of someone's season of life or what someone has. And we will get more into that, into commandment number 10. That's what kind of is alluding to that in a few weeks. But underneath it, most unrighteous jealousy says, I want more than what I have. But God's jealousy is altogether different, because God's jealousy is actually fueled by his love for you. Because where there is love, there is jealousy, okay? Where there is love, there is jealousy. So this is a silly example, but think of it like this. If I go home today and I see another guy at my house, like just hanging out with his feet propped up on our couch in the living room. And I'm like, hey, honey, who's this guy? What's going on here? And she says, oh yeah, I wanted to introduce you to my boyfriend. I hope you're cool with it. I hope you're fine with that, but just want to introduce you. I know it's been a while, but I want to introduce you to my boyfriend. I would not be cool with that. And I would not be like, oh, hey man, good to meet you. Like, are you gonna stay for dinner? We're gonna watch a movie tonight. That's awesome. No, I would not be cool with that. And I might even try to fight this guy. I know I don't look like a fighter, but I fight dirty. I'm scrappy like that, okay? And I would argue that is actually an appropriate reaction because of the love for my wife. It leads me to this righteous sense of jealousy, because where there is love, there is jealousy. And God's love is selfless and is committed and exclusive to his people. And God knows the best possible thing for our souls is for us to be forever satisfied in all that he is and all that he has done forever, to be swept up in his never-ending, relentless love for us. And until we realize that, we're going to continue making a fake image of God to satisfy us. And God's righteous jealousy is a holy discontentment that says, I want so much more for you than this. You are settling for something less than, and I love you so much more than to see you settle for anything less than me, because I ultimately know what is best for you. And when we create God in a false image, we're essentially turning to a different partner, and we're running into the arms of a different lover. We're saying, God, I don't want you for who you are, so I'm going to take matters into my own hands, and I'm going to modify you just a bit, and I'm going to swap out some things that I don't like of you for things that I do like, to make you more palatable, to make you cater to my needs, to make you ultimately serve me so that I don't have to serve you, because honestly, I think I know what's best. I think I know what's best for me, so I'm going to have you play on my terms. And God, in his righteous jealousy and holy discontentment, says, when we turn him into an image, he's saying anything less than who I am will destroy you from the inside out. Because an idol, a fake image of me, is not big enough to handle what your soul ultimately wants and needs at the end of the day. And that is me and me alone. Romans 1 talks about this, sort of alluding to the breaking of the second commandment. The New Testament writer Paul puts it like this. He says, for although they knew God, they referring to humanity, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. And there is a lot that can be said about these verses, like this passage is a sermon or two in and of itself. And I just want to make one little observation, is to note the trajectory of what is going on in that passage. Really, to pick up this theme in verses 23 and 25, that they did not want to acknowledge or worship God for who he truly was. So in exchange, in return, they created a fake image of God to worship. And when they did, notice the trajectory of their souls. It says their hearts became darkened. Their minds, they became foolish in their thinking. Ultimately, it says that we inevitably become what we worship. We inevitably become what we worship. So in a positive sense, think about this. In a positive sense, when I worship God rightly for who he truly is, when that happens, we become more like God. This is what theologians call the process of sanctification. When I worship God and enjoy him and delight him for who he truly is, not a fake image, but a God of the scriptures, when I embrace him for all he is, when I delight and worship him, I, in the process, slowly over time, begin to look more like God, and I begin to exhibit what Galatians 5 calls the fruit of the Spirit, that the attributes of him, his joy, his love, his peace, when I worship him rightly, slowly over time, those attributes begin to radiate from me because he is the wellspring and source of life, and I experience more of God, and I experience more life when I see him correctly. But on the reverse side, and this is what Romans 1 is talking about, when I create an idol, an image of God, the reverse happens to me. I shut myself off from the wellspring of life, and in the process, I slowly become more and more, my mind and my thinking slowly become more and more devolved, slowly. Less and less light, more and more darkness, less and less life, and more death. More allowing myself to call the shots, slowly in the process, becoming less and less human. Because I'm worshiping something less than what I actually need and long for. I put God in the wrong place underneath me, and in the end, when I create a false image, I'm worshiping myself. The illustration we said in the book, For Our Good Always, when we talk about this commandment, is that we are slowly becoming a lot like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. If you've ever read the books or seen the movies, you know, he wasn't always like that, but he was someone who looked just like us and had friends and family, but was corrupted by the ring of power. And in the process, he just slowly begins to shut everyone else out. He slowly begins living in the dark and living alone and losing all grip on reality. And when we worship any God, whether it's a false God or a false image of who God is, this is what is happening. I'm detaching myself from reality, and in the process, I'm becoming something awful. And the effects are similar when I break the second commandment. The effects are similar with breaking the first commandment, that when you worship a false God, it's inevitably going to destroy you from the inside out. The same is true for worshiping a false image of who God is. So if my image of God is all about my comfort and freedom, then I'm going to build my life around thinking it's all about me, and all relationships exist to serve and gratify me. And if any relationships confront me or disrupt my way of life, then I need to get rid of them and cut the toxic people out and practice more self-care and have some distance from those people. And in the process, when I do that, slowly over time, my mind and my heart become darkened and disconnected from reality and full of loneliness and pride. And if my image of God is someone who approves of my lifestyle choices and who never calls me out or anyone else out in their sin, then I'm worshiping a fantasy version of God, disconnected from the scriptures, and he ultimately serves the whims and desires of whatever my culture says or whatever my flesh says, and it will slowly destroy my ability to live in any semblance of reality. And if my image of God is all justice and no forgiveness, then I will slowly destroy my ability to have a relationship or friendship with anyone. Because ultimately, to have any sort of friendship or relationship with anyone is to understand that I am going to sin against them and they're going to sin against me. But if my understanding of God has no room for forgiveness, then ultimately my life will be filled with loneliness. And if my image of God demands I perform and perfect myself, then I will delude my mind and my heart to ignore the grace of God as I slowly crush myself under the weight of my own impossible expectations. Worshiping a false image of God slowly distorts and destroys us from the inside out. And there's more. Keep reading with me. Verse 9, God says, "You shall not bow down or serve them, for I, the Lord, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." Again, another head scratcher, because at first glance, it's like, wait a sec. Are you saying you're going to punish innocent grandkids? Is that what you're doing here? No, that is not what's going on. Rather, this passage is referring to the generational effect that sin can have on a family and a culture and a society. But the point that Deuteronomy is making is that these consequences of idolatry, they don't just end on us, that when I worship a false image of God, it ultimately just destroys me. But no, when you worship a false god, it has far-reaching effects on those around us and after us. There is a generational and societal effect when it comes to breaking the second commandment, so that even when I am long gone, the effects of what I have done in this life have reverberating effects to the third and the fourth generation. Think about it like this to give you a couple of examples. Think about the mother who idolizes image, idolizes self-image. She creates a God who only cares about external appearances, a God who tells you that your value is wrapped up in how others see you. If you're respectable or desirable, all depends on how well you impress others. So she becomes a mother who aggressively manages her family's appearances, from the clothes they wear to the places they go to the people they are seen with. And she constantly comments on her child's appearance. She becomes the mom who consistently makes side comments about her children's physical appearance and weight because her Stepford God cares about these things. Now, just imagine in that scenario, what happens to that child? What happens to that child when they become a father or mother? Well, he or she likely grows up with image issues of their own, perhaps leading to insecurity and depression over their looks, whether that looks like an eating disorder or extreme self-criticism. It has a reverberating effect to the next generation. Or you think about the parent whose Stepford God cares only about sexual fulfillment. So faithfulness and promiscuity do not matter in their household. And their children witness the ongoing parade of partners coming through their mother or father's bedroom door. What happens to that child? What happens to that child? Well, they will likely grow up with the same view of sex and relationships, and they are likely to carry on that same idolatry after them. And if they don't become a carbon copy of their parents, maybe they're just left just feeling the impact of their parents' idolatry and sin, and are just left confused as to what a relationship looks like or what a marriage looks like. Or they become a Christian and they're like, I want to love my spouse, but I don't know what that looks like. I want to be a godly man, a godly woman. I want to raise my kids. I have no idea what that looks like. It is the generational impact of breaking the second commandment. And think about this. What happens when and if an entire group of people break the second commandment? A community or a society worships a false view of God, and what that looks like to the third and fourth generation. The destruction gets multiplied. So what happens when a culture turns God into a God who doesn't care about sin, but only exists to affirm us and whatever we want to do? I would imagine it becomes a society where sin is taught to be celebrated and true righteousness is to be condemned and mocked and made fun of. Or what happens when a society turns God into a being of supreme justice, but not of supreme grace? I imagine it becomes a society where ideological opponents must at the very least be canceled, but more likely they must be driven out and destroyed altogether with no hopes of restoration or redemption or forgiveness. Commandment number 2, when broken, doesn't just impact us, but it impacts families and generations and society as a whole. But here's the beautiful news, okay? Coming out of what is said in verse 9. Here's coming the good news coming fresh off the heels of verse 9. The sins of the parents come back to visit their children, but look at this, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And we're meant to sort of pick up on the contrast and the juxtaposition in this passage that God, when we break the second commandment, the impacts of that go on to the third and fourth generation. But for those who love him, who worship him, his love extends to the thousands. We're supposed to see 3 to 4 compared to the thousands, and how amazing and how beautiful that is. His loyal love extending to the thousands. That word, loyal love, is this Hebrew word hesed, and some people translate it as loyalty or faithfulness or a resolved commitment. For those that pursue him, for who God really is, who don't settle for a false version of him, he extends his hesed love to you, and he will not and cannot turn his back from you because he is jealous for you, and he is so committed to you. And where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more, which means his hesed love for you is bigger and greater than your sin, and it's bigger and greater than your idolatry. It's bigger and greater than any false images you could create of him, and his hesed love is what rescues us from that idolatry. His hesed love extends to the thousands. The point being, his love is big enough to swallow up all of our idolatry, its presence, and its consequences. For those that pursue God for who he really is and don't settle for a false version, his hesed love has the power to break whatever generational patterns and effects have been passed down to you so that the legacy can begin with you, where you might extend love and grace and Jesus on to the next generations forever and ever, and on it goes. You see, what ultimately is true about God is that he is not a Stepford God, and he is not a spouse simply created for our own purposes who is indifferent to our spiritual adultery. Rather, he is the God who is aggressively faithful despite our aggressive unfaithfulness. Perhaps one of the best, most beautiful examples of this is in the Old Testament in the book of Hosea. Hosea is this beautiful biblical illustration where Hosea is a prophet at that time in Israel, and God tells Hosea, I want to show my people just how committed I am to loving them. So here's what I want you to do, Hosea. I want you to go out into the city. I want you to marry a prostitute. And I want you to know that this prostitute is not going to turn from her ways, but you're going to have to continue loving her and pursuing her, even when she is unfaithful to you. And the whole point of that is like, whoa, are we sure that's a good move, Hosea? Because I don't know, like, if I were you, I would not want to do that. But the whole point is, no, Hosea, I want you to continue pursuing them and to be faithful to them despite their unfaithfulness, because I want my people to see that's how much I love them. Because even when they are unfaithful to me, I will continue being faithful to them, to love them and to pursue them and woo them back into relationship. And the big idea is, despite our spiritual adultery, despite our spiritual prostitution, God chases us down. You see, while we in so many ways attempt to recreate God into an image of our own liking, God already has an image, and that image is Jesus. And the image of Jesus is meant to woo us back to him, woo us back to faithfulness to him. We don't have to construct a false image of God to figure out who he is. God has already created an image of himself, and his name is Jesus. And what the life of Jesus tells us is that God's jealous love will stop at nothing, to redeem his bride. That despite her unfaithfulness, despite her desire for him to be something other than he is, God comes to the rescue. God comes to pay the price that our idolatry deserves. He takes all of that righteous indignation at our unfaithfulness and pours every last drop of it onto himself. And he did so willingly because of his hesed love to you, because of his faithfulness to you. Despite our near constant running to the arms of a false God, God, out of his righteous jealousy, keeps choosing to love you. A gentle and humble love that seeks after you, that pursues you no matter what, no matter where you've been or what you've done. God's love continues to pursue you. A God who continues to bring us back home time and time again. A God who leaves the 99 to go find you, to go find the lost wayward sheep. His mercy doesn't stop. His love does not end. And he continues through his son Jesus to woo us back to faithfulness. All because God is a jealous God, and God loves you too much to share with anyone or anything else. But the only way you can see that and be satisfied in that is when you see God's image of himself through his son Jesus, to look up and see your God, whose jealous love is so great that he climbed the mount of crucifixion for you. And if you want to know God's infinite power, look to Jesus, who conquered sin and death to rescue you from your idolatry. And if you want to know God's infinite wisdom, look to the words of Jesus, who offers you the rest that you are really longing for. Even when you were making your own idols, even when you were breaking the second commandment, God loves you with an unflinching, loyal love, no hesitation whatsoever. He continues to rescue us and save us. If you want to know the infinite love of God, look to Jesus, who took the penalty of sin, who saw all your failings, all your misgivings, and who pursues you no matter what at great cost to himself, so that you might know the infinite, loyal, hesed love of God forever and ever and ever.